this is the second conversation that we're doing as part of the Bookstock.
They're not still sorry.
Like we said early on,
so.
you know, this is, Joe had said, this isn't a Copper and Kings event, this is a writers event. This is a drink writers event. But as all of you know, Copper and Kings is obviously a brandy distillery, which may only make sense that now we're going to talk about whiskey for a while. So of course, also being in Louisville, if we're going to talk about whiskey, that means we're going to talk about Canadian whiskey. So that's why we have Davin de Kergommeaux. Did I get it? Third try.
He got it right the first time.
All right. I've been practicing that all night, trying not to screw up. We have Davin, who's written several books on Canadian whiskey. Actually, your third is coming out in 2020. Is that correct?
It's coming out on March 30th, 2020. And if you pre-order it, it really helps me.
That's true. So everybody pull out your phones right now and pre-order Davin's book.
And that will be called The Definitive Guide to Canadian Distilleries, correct?
The Definitive Guide to Canadian Distilleries. I have a little brochure on my desk.
Fantastic.
And it's free, that brochure.
Does it include the illegal ones, Davin?
We only had 320 pages, Fred.
Okay.
So we could only include the legal ones.
So we've got Davin, and Davin, you've been writing about Canadian whiskey for the better part of 2 decades, correct? Somewhere around there?
Yeah.
Somewhere, okay, all right,
Yeah,
close enough. And then, of course, if we're going to be in Louisville talking about whiskey, we need to talk about bourbon at some point, which means Fred Minnick was invited to the stage to join us and talk about bourbon. Fred is the editor-in-chief of Bourbon Plus. He's also the author of several books on spirits, including his latest, Mead.
Right. So a bourbon guy writes about mead. It makes sense.
Yeah.
That's
anyway,
M-E-A-D, not M-E.
So, I just want to kick it over to you guys because obviously you're coming at whiskey from 2 different angles and you're both really enthusiastic about the styles of whiskey that you write about. What is it for you, Davin? I mean, you've been doing it for 20 years. Fred, you've been doing it for a long time. I don't know exactly how many years. What is it
13.
about you, 13 years that have held your interest and that keeps you going on these respective styles? And then I'll just let you fight it out from there.
Well, you know, Paul, it's really interesting. That's like what we were discussing today at dinner. There's always something new. There's always something new happening in Canadian whiskey. And Canadian whiskey is it's kind of flies under the radar, like most Canadians do. Yeah, I have to tell you, I got stopped at customs coming home from a whiskey show, and they x-rayed my bag, sent me to secondary inspection, found a box of books in my bag, and I sold one to the customs guy. Okay, no, but we've been making great whiskey in Canada for over 200 years, and beginning with the American Civil War, Canadian whiskey was the best-selling style of whiskey in the United States of America until 2010, when Fred arrived on the scene and turned people on to bourbon. And bourbon became the best-selling whiskey, which it still is.
Well, yeah, it's funny.
You don't drink that much bourbon, Fred, do you?
It's funny. He brings up the 1800s because it's because of the Canadian whiskey blenders coming to the United States of America and having an impact on the market here that they passed the Bottle and Bond Act. And that was actually one of the big reasons why they passed the Bottle and Bond Act, because you guys were coming down here and undercutting all the good whiskey.
You know what? The consumers don't agree with you, though, because the consumers bought the Canadian whiskey.
Listen, let's be honest. The consumers also buy vodka.
Fred, there is no comeback to that. Okay? It's now Christians 0, Lions 1.
No, it is interesting, like the connection between the historical sales patterns of bourbon and Canadian whiskey are very connected. And every time that Canadian whiskey starts coming in and making a splash, bourbon makes a move. It really does. But one of the biggest impacts that you've ever made on American whiskey from a Canadian perspective is that a little brand called Crown Royal forced the Seagram's family, the Brothmans, to take Four Roses off the market and in the United States. And that was a great selling product here in the United States.
Yeah. Well, I don't know the history of Four Roses. I do know that the Seagrams owned Four Roses. My understanding is that it was a bleak period for Four Roses, quite honestly, when they did. But Crown Royal, I mean, has got to be like the quintessential example of an almost perfectly made whiskey. They make that whiskey the same way, one batch after the other. The blenders are now blenders. And I know, I mean, even I've done this myself. You can take, the honey barrels. You can take the great whiskey. You can put it together, and you can make sensational whiskey. But to be able to do the same thing over and over and over, decade after decade, that is a different matter. So yes, Crown Royal is truly an example of the art of blending whiskey, and they sell 17,000 cases a year.
That's the purple bag.
Yeah. Well, no. I think that some people do like the purple bag so they can make themselves a jacket or, carry.
They do. I mean, you see like blankets of the purple bag. It's like, and then you have other brands like Blanton's and Van Winkle. Like, hey, we need a bag, so.
Or maybe you should say we don't need a bag. But in any case, regardless of why Canadian whiskey is so, sensationally popular, I think we tend to forget, as people who love whiskey, who live whiskey, who consume whiskey with such relish, we seem to forget that making and selling whiskey is a business, and the bottom line is you have to remain solvent. And if you find a product that consumers really enjoy, for whatever reason, then you are addressing the needs of your board of directors. However, if we're going to talk about Crown Royal, which is one of the best-selling whiskeys in the entire world, we have to also remember that Crown Royal produces enormous quantities of really high-end whiskeys. A perfect example, someone asked me today, what's my favorite whiskey right now? And, man, I love some of the whiskeys that are coming out of Canada. But right now, today, if you asked me, you could pour me any Canadian whiskey that I wanted, I would ask for Crown Royal, the 13-year-old French oak. My goodness, this is just wonderful. And it's like $80 or something. Maybe that's a lot of money in America, but in Canada, it's really an inexpensive whiskey,
Well, most of that goes to Canadian taxes. You guys are, you gotta pay for all that stuff.
The thing about excise tax, Fred, is it's not paid on whiskey that is exported. So you guys don't pay the tax. In Canada, our taxes are outrageous.
I mean, it's horrible.
260%, some people are saying, for...
Can you imagine that, going to the store and you're 260% of the bottle you're buying is gone to taxes?
No, it's not 260% of the bottle you're buying.
Is it the...
Because you only pay 100% of whatever the price is.
By the way, we're getting a nice lesson in Canadian math right now. I'm loving this.
But they take the retail price, and if you add all the different taxes in, it more than doubles. More than doubles, and in case of some of the small distilleries, it more than triples the cost, the price of the whiskey, the cost of the whiskey. So maybe they're taking home $2 or $3 a bottle on a $25 bottle of whiskey. It's really quite outrageous, the taxes in Canada. I agree with you on that. Absolutely no question. But you don't have to pay our Canadian taxes on Canadian whiskey.
Here's another thing that's different between our governments is that here in Bourbon land, you can't add any flavoring to your whiskey.
Well, now that is sheer, utter, complete, and total nonsense.
Now, let's take a look at the laws of what Canadian whiskey is. You can add up to 9.09% of other spirits. So what, by the way, who came up with 9.09%? What is up with that? I mean, why not 9.11 for 911?
Well, the reason is very simple. You can take 10 parts of mature whiskey and 1 part of something else, which is most often is 2-year-old rye, by the way, and you can blend them together and still call it whiskey. You can still say it's mature whiskey. So 1 plus 10 is 11. 9.09%. You can do Canadian math. 9.09% is the same as 1/11. That's the way they come up with that. But this is something that people really don't understand. Like rye, you know, rye spirit, after 2 years in barrels, this rye spirit can be wonderfully good. But
This is true.
we have a law in Canada that says you can't call it whiskey until it's 3 years old minimum. And nobody sells it at 3. They sell the 4 is about the youngest you can get. But what they can do is they can take this 2-year-old rye spirit, which just sings, just dances on top of the whiskey, and they can add that to the mature whiskey in there, and they can still call it whiskey. But there's another really cool thing that we do in Canada that again is misunderstood by people who have been, you know, whose whole whiskey knowledge is based on mash bills. In Canada, we
You mean like the mash bills on Crown that said bourbon mash?
No, I'm not done with that. What we do, yes, they make bourbon in Manitoba at Crown Royal. We just can't call it bourbon. But no, what we do is we take the rye grain, we distill it separately, and we mature it in barrels that are just toasted so that it really brings out the spiciness of the rye. We take the corn and we distill it separately. We ferment, and distill it separately, mature it in heavily charred new oak barrels. We take the barley and we do it separately, and the wheat as well, and then we bring them together after they are mature spirits. So what we're really saying is that, you know, if you're making bourbon, you blend the grains into a mash bill and ferment them all together, and it makes a wonderful. By the way, I just totally love most bourbon, so I'm not going to trash it. In Canada, we blend the grains after they've been matured, so it's not really much different. It's just that we use a special process so that we get the maximum flavor out of each grain. But the difference is in the numbers. Now, if you ferment corn, you can get 14, 15, even 16% alcohol in corn, from corn. In rye, you're going to get something like 5, maybe 6% alcohol. So when you bring equal quantities of rye and corn spirit together, you're actually adding 2.5 times the amount of rye that it actually says in the blend. So it's kind of a kind of a different approach to doing the same thing, to bringing different grains together into a single spirit.
You know, you're right. And so the spirit of this conversation, it's like blends versus straight. In the creation of straight American whiskey, and the term straight, by the way, it comes from a time in the 1800s when people were often buying stolen whiskey, like a lot of whiskey was being stolen. And they would say, you know, the people who were buying like real whiskey from real purveyors, they would say, that's good whiskey, it's straight. And the term straight caught on, and it eventually received a definition in the federal code here that it has to be at least 2 years old. And so pretty much the majority of American whiskey, you will see straight on the label. And basically from a bottom line definition, it means it has to be at least 2 years old in the barrel. And so the way that Americans have always distilled is that they take the grains and they put them to, you know, they cook them. First they grind them down into kind of like a flour. And then they put them all together in a pot and they cook them so the starches, you know, come out. And then they ferment them, and so they convert to sugar. They get converted to sugar, and then they are fermented and created into alcohol, and that is what is distilled. And what makes the American process unique is that they distill the grains and the liquid together versus like taking out the grains and just distilling the liquid. And what Davin is basically saying is like they do that process, but they do it with 100% of the grains. So when they're distilling corn, it's 100%. Or when they're distilling a bourbon mash, which I've spent a lot of time in Canada, they call it a bourbon mash, but they're not allowed to call it bourbon on a label. And that actually came out very recently when Crown Royal, who is a fantastic brand and has moved the needle in a lot of circles. By the way, Crown Royal does really, really well with cowboys. really well. It's odd, but they spent all this money in the 1960s marketing to the National Finals Rodeo. And so they were the main sponsor of the NFR for like 30 years. And so all these cowboys with belt buckles bigger than my head were drinking Crown Royal. And you see that when you go to country music festivals and everything, but they're Crown drinkers, sometimes Jack, but that's a side note. But very recently, you know, I want to get your take on this, of like what you think about the Crown Royal snafu, in which they put bourbon mash on their label. I mean, you saw what the bourbon world did. They lost their shit over that.
Well, yeah. First of all, let me say that as someone who writes about Canadian whiskey, I was once invited to a rodeo to present the buckles to the best bull riders. So
Did you do it?
I've ridden a mechanical bull. Well, my rear end was near a mechanical bull for a very short period of time. Put it that way. Okay. I couldn't believe people going crazy over them putting bourbon mash on the label. In Canada, it's still called bourbon mash. Because they never tried to call it
on the
bourbon.
Production side, right?
No, on the label that you buy at the liquor store.
No, but I mean in Canada, it's called the bourbon mash in the production side of the house. Normal consumers don't understand.
Yeah. Production side is called bourbon mash. In fact, the mash is I think 61% corn and maybe 32% rye, and the rest is barley. And they distill it in two different ways. But really you can call it bourbon mash, but really they don't call it that at the distillery. They just call it mash, because Crown Royal, they do each grain separately, like I said before, but they also do some whiskey from a mash. And if they distill it in what they call a bourbon still or a beer still, which is a very short column, then they take that spirit, distill it one time, put it in new oak barrels, and it tastes just like bourbon. You'd think it was bourbon, and they use that as that's the bourbon flavor that you taste in Crown Royal. But if they take exactly the same mash, in fact, it can be from the very same batch, and distill it in a coffee still. They have the only operating coffee still in Canada. They call it rye, and it tastes exactly like American rye whiskey. So it kind of shows that the mash bill is not the only contributor to the flavor of the whiskey. It's how it is distilled. We have other distilleries in Canada who distill 100% rye grain, and it doesn't taste like rye at all because they distill the rye character out. But in terms of putting bourbon mash on the label, I couldn't understand why people were losing their shit, as you said. And I think it was a few toxic fans who got this going.
Toxic fans in bourbon? No! It doesn't exist.
Yeah, some of them they have their own magazine. And, okay, it's now Christians 1, Lions 1.
I think I need more brandy.
But seriously, yeah, maybe it did kind of tweak a few people to sell it in Texas with the word bourbon on the label. They still do that in Canada, but they never tried to pretend it was bourbon. It said Canadian whiskey a blend. So, but maybe. Well,
but it's not the first time that the Canadians have tried to copycat Americans to get a little shelf space. And I will cite a time after Prohibition, and that's when the Canadians were trying to do bottled and bond. And you had Shenley, you had all these Canadian whiskey brands that were coming out as bottled and bond bourbon. And the reason why is because they had the stocks, they had the mature whiskey that the Americans did not. And what did the Americans do? Well, we did what we do when it comes to governments. We tariff and we go back and negotiating free trade agreements and so forth. But that was a real messy time between our two countries, and we almost had a little mini trade war in the 1930s and 40s over the fact that the Canadians were basically trying to label their stuff bottled and bond, an American term.
You know, Fred, you know your history, and he does know his history. But let me just tell you something that maybe puts a different light on that. 1887 was the first time that any government anywhere in the world had required that whiskey be aged, and it was the government of Canada. And Canada said you have to age your whiskey for a minimum. They said 1 year during the grandfathering period, and then 2 years after that, and it's 3 years now. And so Canada became the first country to require whiskey be aged, and 2 years was the minimum. All whiskey. So I guess you could say all Canadian whiskey is straight whiskey. But then, of course, 27 years later, the Scots did it. Well, I happened to read the correspondence between the government of Scotland and the government of Canada on what were the effects of forcing distillers to age their whiskey for 2 years. There were two effects. Number one, all the people who cheated on their taxes were put out of business, and the big distillers prospered. And so, and what's interesting is the discussions did not ever talk about the quality of the whiskey. All they talked about was maximizing the tax income. So that's the reason they had aging. Now, during Prohibition...
That sounds familiar, by the way, maximizing taxes.
During Prohibition and before Prohibition, and for a significant period after Prohibition, American bourbon bottles were being filled with Canadian whiskey. We used to make Old Overholt in Montreal. That was made in Canada. A number of very prominent bourbon brands were made in Canada. And it's just the practicality of continuing to supply good whiskey to people while that nonsense you call Prohibition was going on. And so yes, we did very much copy. And you know, I know that like Corby Distilleries, when they were in Corbyville, they had several different lines of whiskey. They made whiskey to sell in Canada. They made whiskey to sell in America. The Canadian whiskey was made the Canadian way. The American whiskey they had American bourbon and American rye. The label said American bourbon made in Corbyville, American rye made in Corbyville, or made in Windsor, or made in Montreal. And they were made to American specs, using American style mash bills, following American style regulations, and maturing them in an American style, brand new oak barrels. So I just can't disagree with you. We certainly did make an awful lot of American whiskey. We did not do that to capture your market or to deceive you, because it was Americans who were buying it from us and putting it in their bottles.
You're very much Canadian proud. I appreciate that.
And right.
Spoken like a true Canadian. Well played. There's another thing that they are really connected to, and they're by my research, you all are the first to basically create flavored whiskey.
I did not know that. I'm sorry, guys. You know what? I had to review flavored whiskey for a few years for a magazine. The best editorial decision that has ever made anywhere was to stop reviewing. I do not enjoy flavored whiskey.
My
wife does.
It is.
Hey,
really?
There's Josh. What's my wife's favorite whiskey, Josh?
Black Velvet Toasted Caramel.
It's Black Velvet Toasted Caramel. And you know what flavored whiskey has done for my family? It means that Janet and I can sit by the fire together and dram. We can sit by the fire together, sip our whiskey, and talk. Thank you, Josh.
Flavored whiskey is keeping your family together, keeping.
Flavored whiskey. And by the way, Fireball uses Canadian whiskey as well.
I'm not going to venture down that line. I don't want to give. I don't want to give another point to the Lions.
Other brands that use Canadian whiskey have quite prospered with it. Whistle Pig has done quite well with Canadian whiskey.
Yeah.
And so my question to you really, and this is every time I sit down with anybody from Canada who's in the whiskey business, why the hell don't you all claim your good stuff and sell it in the United States? I mean, really, you all seem to be very much, until Lot 40 and those guys came around, you didn't really see a lot of the premium Canadian whiskey coming into the United States.
I can't really explain that, but I know that Whistle Pig turned the corner on premium whiskey in America. But you have to remember, if you go
for
back,
Canadian whiskey.
For Canadian whiskey.
Specifically.
For Canadian whiskey. If you go back to before the 1980s, though, there were monster big, bold Canadian whiskeys like Merit and Canadian Masterpiece that were selling well in the United States of America. You can still find some really great old Calverts in the United States of America, some great old Canadian whiskeys down here. But honestly, when we got to the 80s and the whiskey started to dry up and everybody started drinking that stuff with the V, vodka.
It shall not be spoken.
And you know, we began to make our whiskey light. You made your whiskey lighter. The Scots made their whiskey lighter. But somehow Canadian whiskey kind of got the reputation. And my microphone's going off, which I think maybe some people are thankful for. But in any case, I don't know. Like we really don't wave our flag a lot, Canadians. We do kind of fly under the wire. We do kind of stay low key, and it's been more of a pull marketing strategy rather than a push marketing strategy in terms of getting Canadian whiskey into America. It's the same, I get letters all the time from people, they're going to help us launch this brand in Australia, they're going to help us launch this brand in Germany or someplace or whatever, wherever. Well, Canadian distillers don't want to launch a brand in Australia unless there's some sign of longevity, like they've got good distribution there. They've got a company that's got the resources to make it go. So people haven't been pulling the high-end Canadian whiskey into their country until, Dave Pickerel came. And Dave Pickerel, he told me, I searched the whole world for the best rye in the whole world, and I found it in Alberta. And so that's why we bought Canadian rye to put in Whistle Pig. It could have been Dutch rye, it could have been American rye, but we wanted something that was really going to be premium and consistent, and of which there was a large supply. So that's the one that he went with.
And by the way, I'm wearing a pin right now in honor of Dave, who passed away last year. This whole conversation about, Canadian whiskey, and like American whiskey, it's one where I think we're not enemies by any means.
Not by any means.
And you and I personally, I admire you. We've been friends for a very long time. But
I've known you for a long time, Fred.
But you all do things so well played. He's now 2.
I think
1.
I think it's Kristen's 1.5.
2. So when we look at in terms of just the mood around the distilleries, it's so different in Canada. When I go to any distillery in America, and anybody could, with the exception of a couple, and go in and take a tour and do all that. You go to Canada and they're you can't take flash pictures in here, you can't look at this, you can't do that. I just feel like Canada is so much more restrictive, and I really do think it hurts you all. Whereas here, we're everybody come in until you fall in. Eventually, someone's going to fall into a mash tun or something. But everyone's come on in and have a good time. I just feel like it's so different in Canada. And I know he is truly, what you all don't understand, he is truly the face of Canadian whiskey. And he is truly the person that, he's awarded he's the equivalent of a knight in Canada because of his appreciation and promotions editorially of Canadian whiskey. He is a god in Canadian whiskey. He really is. So I don't understand. I don't understand why.
Well, Fred, it's a different personality. It's really true. Canadians don't show off, and we don't really talk about ourselves a lot. You get a bunch of people in a room, and one's a Canadian, and they're doing the least talking. I'm an exception, perhaps. And, you know, it's a different personality, and it's not like we're trying to take over the world. You know, we're happy to sell as much whiskey abroad as we can, but we do it a different way. And I know I was at a show a while ago, and there was an American person there. He's telling us what we have to do. We have to do this. You know, we need this kind of website, and we need to this and everything. Like, no, we that's not Canadian. That's not the way we do it in Canada. We don't talk a lot. We hope that we have some substance when people find us, when people discover us. We hope that we have the substance to, make them happy that they have discovered us. This is happening over and over again with Canadian whiskey. And I have to tell you, I discovered Canadian whiskey at a very, very exclusive tasting by invitation only, held annually in Las Vegas. I went down there, there were hundreds and hundreds of the most expensive single malt scotches on the table. There were bourbons that were like 10, 15 years older than that, all this stuff, all on free pour. And these guys whose opinions, like, I really respected, I was nervous drinking in their company, they were drinking Canadian whiskey, Order of Merit. They were drinking Canadian Masterpiece, whiskeys like this. And I thought, like, holy crow, are these guys nuts? And then, but I tried some, and I thought, that really was the point where I was converted. It was like eureka. I'm living with this stuff. I'm interested. I'm learning about the distilleries, but I haven't really yet figured out what the really good stuff is, because I just haven't had someone I respect tell me about it. So I was there in Las Vegas drinking this. I went back the next 4 years just to mingle with these people and learn about stuff. So yeah, we have some fabulous whiskey, but I have to tell you, I wrote a story about for the Malt Maniacs, but that was decades ago, from one of those adventures, and it was all bourbon that I wrote about, because the best whiskeys there that year happened to be bourbons. So yeah, we have wonderful whiskey.
It's pretty common though, right?
It's pretty common. The bourbon is excellent, yeah. If that's what you're saying, yeah.
I want to make sure that we leave time for questions from the crowd. So
I know we can just keep yammering now.
Yeah, that's apparent.
Sorry, Paul. What did you say?
Wait. You were supposed to moderate this,
I
right?
know. I mean, I couldn't get a word in edgewise.
I didn't hear.
So I want to make sure that these guys have an opportunity.
They want to ask questions.
So, do we have questions from the crowd? Yeah, and we have a microphone right here coming over.
I enjoyed your book, Whiskey Women.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Excellent. What inspired you to write that book?
What inspired me to write that book? Honestly, it was there was a lot of things that inspired me to write the book. One, I met with Peggy No Stevens when she was creating an organization called Bourbon Women. And she said that women were like the original, distillers, and there were all these people in the industry. And I couldn't really, the industry did not celebrate women at that time. And I basically, essentially was fact-checking her, and my agent at that time was like, you can't write this, you can't write a whiskey book. No one's interested in it. And I really looked to my wife, who's in the crowd here. She's awesome, by the way. And all these amazing women in my life. One of the big things in my life was I went to Iraq. I was a soldier in Iraq, and my unit was I had a lot of women in my unit. I was a sergeant over a lot of women, and it was like their performance in the field made me really, that inspired me to like try and find stories about women at a time that no one was really talking about it, like 2005, 2006. And so that combo was really what inspired me. But thank you for that. And the film rights just got bought for that, so I'm hoping that it gets turned into a movie or.
Congratulations, man.
but it's most likely an original Lifetime series of bootlegging women, you know.
Right. All right, other questions?
Thank you.
So, Gavin, you're talking about the process in which Canadian whiskey is made and how that differs from American whiskey.
Yeah.
Do you see a regional specificity of style? For example, if you were blindfolded, would you be able to taste the difference between an Ontarian whiskey versus a Northwest Territory whiskey?
There are two answers to that question. The first one is no, and the second one is yes. And there's a reason. There's a very good reason for that. Until about 5 years ago, there were only about 8 distilleries really making whiskey in Canada. And I could tell you which distillery made that, but every distillery had its own house style, and there was not a regional style. Since then, we have had like 251, we have now 257 distilleries or something like that. Probably more than half of them are making whiskey. And you now definitely can see the influence of terroir on the micro-distilled spirits. With the big distilleries, well, maybe Alberta distillers, because they buy their grain walking distance or now driving distance from the distillery, their rye, they use mostly rye. But
It should be pointed out too that like a lot of American distilleries buy their rye from Canada. That's a premium rye growing country.
yeah,
So
we
it's
grow
big deal.
But among the small distillers, you do see some kind of regional styles starting to emerge. I don't think that I could pick out BC whiskey from another yet, but I think that's going to happen. But I can definitely tell you micro-distilled rye that is produced in Ontario. If you get rye from Stillwater's Distillery, Stock and Barrel Rye, you get Dillon's rye. It is unique. There is no other rye whiskey in the world that tastes like this. It's like, you know the way you can taste like some of the Scandinavian ryes, and they really taste like they have that Scandinavian flavor. There's an Ontario terroir definitely demonstrated in some of the small distilleries. Big distilleries, other than Alberta distillers, I think they probably don't really know where their rye comes from. We also have some of the big distilleries are starting to use hybrid ryes, which don't have the same kind of flavor. You know, it's too bad, but the volumes are so large now they have to go to those high producing ryes.
Okay, cool. We have time for one more. One more question.
Oh,
Mr.
is
Simonson.
that fair though to give
Yeah,
the microphone
sure,
to
of course
Robert?
It's fair.
This is in the name of peacemaking.
Peacemaking and you're breaking our ears open, huh? Nice soup, by the way, Robert. Very nice
Thanks,
soup.
Fred. Fred, what is your favorite Canadian whiskey? And Davin, what is your favorite American whiskey?
It's a very easy question for me to answer. I'm a huge fan of Caribou Crossing. I think that is an incredible whiskey. It is like it is actually very Bourbon-esque and quite tasty. Big fan of Caribou.
Well, you've got a good palate, because I love Caribou Crossing. You've picked a good whiskey, and I can't get past Maker's Mark 46. I just love Maker's Mark 46. Maybe that shows that I haven't developed my palate for the really odd flavors, but I love Maker's Mark 46. I really do. But I really like a lot of bourbons. I have to say, I prefer the bourbons that are not at cask strength. But I like, what's my favorite style of American whiskey? Bourbon.
That's a pretty easy answer there.
All right, well, thank you guys so much for taking us through whiskey. We have one more conversation coming up after this. We're going to take a short little break. Be sure to go grab a book. Mini books, bring them out, have them signed by us. We're going to be back with that the third conversation, just in a few minutes, and then we have 2 more tomorrow, so be sure to come back tomorrow. But we'll be back in just a few minutes.
That's
Thanks
fun.
very much, friend. You're awesome. You really are.
You're great.